At this time, can I ask Ms. Krystyna Zamorska to come up? Ms. Zamorska is the daughter and granddaughter of victims of World War II. She was born in Poland, educated in America. She has degrees in cultural anthropology, American and literary studies. She uses both degrees to research the evolving, quote, history of World War II and the consequences of the Cold War on the so-called West. Pani Zamorska.
Dzień dobry, good morning. So this lecture is partly personal because of family history. Most of us in the room are connected to that history through family, and also professional. I became interested in the American version of World War history and crimes against Poland because of what we were hearing and still hear. So the focus of my lecture is the role of the place of the concentration camps in the overall systemic oppression and exploitation and extermination of Poles. But I changed the title since, as I reviewed the material and was preparing the lecture, I changed the title to what reflects the reality more accurately: German system of prisons and camps in the World War II economy, and Stuffhof as an example where my father was interned. My mother was a slave laborer as a child, given to a German farmer, and Volksdeutsch, and my father's father disappeared one day and never came back. So there are personal stories which I'm sure many of you in the room identify. So I'm providing a context of the oppression and the crimes by presenting the system of camps and prisons as an infrastructure, that was all interconnected and shockingly extensive in occupied Poland. So the conference, we're looking at aspects of the war that were left out or are being misrepresented. And Poland is very important in the story of World War II because that's where all of the major German crimes were committed, in occupied Poland. That's where the military-industrial complex was set up. That's where the camps and prisons were set up, and even slave laborers from other countries were imported into Poland. Poland was made invisible to the Allies, and was turned into a slave labor industry for the Third Reich. And because Poland was an ally who got betrayed at the end of the war, the Cold War actually began in the middle of the war in 42, 43 with these negotiations that we just heard about. Poland was left behind the Iron Curtain with all of that history, and it never made it to the West. So the main point of my paper is that what's missing from the Western, so-called Western narrative of World War II is our German crimes committed in occupied Poland. And I want to stress how important that is for the meaning and interpretation of what happened in Europe between, until 1945, by drawing on literary studies. When we tell a story or a play, we use certain elements to analyze what's happening, action, right? We have characters and plot and a conflict that needs to be resolved by the end of the story or play, and location. And location is historical, physical, cultural, and all of that is missing from the narrative of World War II as we hear it in the West. So I'm arguing that until what happened in Poland as the setting, the location, is brought into the Western narrative, the story will be incomplete, will be false, will be not representative of what happened, not only in Poland, but in the rest of Europe. And the story that evolved, I want to stress, some of you may note this, but the Poland being left behind the Iron Curtain with its history, the story in the West with the Nuremberg trials, what happened was that we got, the prevailing narrative was German crimes against humanity. But then, with the Eichmann trial in the beginning of the 1960s, that story kind of came to the forefront and stirred up certain topics and strands of the history, and the narrative changed to a very narrow narrative about German crimes as Nazis and predominantly the genocide of the European Jews. And the rest of the larger context got left out of the narrative. So that's another part, a part that we have to pay attention to. So I want to present the location, the persecution in Poland, which defines certain aspects of the history that define the context, the setting that I'm referring to. I'm pushing the button, nothing's happening. It's happening, okay. So I'll come back to this image, but I just want to show you this as an example. So I'll come back to this at the end, but this is a symbol of the World War II narrative. This is Jan Karski's book. The copy on the right, The Story of a Secret State, is the 1944 edition. If you look on the left, see how different the 2013 reissue is? And that's a commentary on what happened to World War II history from 1944 to 2013, the centennial of his birth. We talked about maps yesterday. This comes from an EPN publication, the Poland before and after World War II. But we want to stress that none of this existed because there was no Poland. Right? When Germany came in and the Soviet Union came in, all of the infrastructures were destroyed. Poland's cultural, political, economic institutions were either destroyed or taken over. So there was no Poland. We always have to say occupied Poland. And the tone of that occupation is summarized in Hans Frank's comment in 1940, which is just a few months into the war. A German journalist asked him how would he compare the protectorate of Moravia with Poland, because he said he wanted to compare. Yes, he wanted to get him to comment on occupation of Poland, and basically what Frank said. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. He said, in the Czech Republic, every time 7 people are shot, there are placards announced and posted on kiosks and public places. He said, if I had to post a placard every time 7 Poles were shot, there would be not enough trees in the forest to produce the paper for making the posters. Yes, we must be ruthless. And they were. And Hans Frank published more than 30 volumes of journals of his occupation, his performance in Poland, which are accessible. So the German occupation of Poland was particular because of Germany and because of Poland. So there was, in my interpretation, there are several aspects that are integrated that influenced the persecution and the organization of that persecution in Poland. So as I mentioned, Polish state, Polish country was criminalized, it did not exist. Being Polish in Poland, in occupied Poland, was criminal. The second is racism, lawlessness, surveillance, policies of terror, and sustained daily violence in public and private sphere. You know family stories. You walked out of the house and you never knew if you'd come back. System of prisons and thousands of internment, slave labor, and concentration camps. I'll show you the list in a moment. The multi-ethnic population of Poland influenced how the occupation proceeded. Poland had 18% of Poland's pre-war population was Ukrainian, 10% Jewish Poles, and Lithuanian, German, and all of that, how ethnic groups were manipulated and old scores played out, influenced the war. The other important aspect is, of course, that Poland was the center of Jewish life in Poland, in Europe, and the sixth is Poland's response to the occupation. Poland was not only the first to fight, but Poland was the first to resist. And the seventh is what we heard also in a previous lecture, is the changing presence and role of the Soviet Union in that war. And when Poland was occupied, we tried to tell the West to get help very early on. There's research being done now that it happened as early as 1940. There's a publication that I came across. I can give you a link to it. It's a book that's published by the Ministry of Information from London, I think in 1941. It has 600 pages. And there were other information was conducted and passed on to the West without consequence, without avail. One of the early publications about what actually happened in Poland was published in 1946 in English here, through the Ivor Institute. And if you look at this is page 26, 22nd of what was bulletin number 1 of the German, Główna Komisja Badania Zbrodni Niemieckich w Polsce, and now it's IPN. So you can look at it, according to this classification, there were 435 networks of camps in occupied Poland. So Stutthof, Gdańsk, for example, is listed here as 1 or 2, but there were over 40 subcamps in the Stutthof camp. One of the most extensive accounts, which is not used much, is this publication, which came out in 1979, and it has almost 700 pages, and it's Obozy hitlerowskie na ziemiach polskich. By now, we also had censorship in Poland after 49-50, which we went from niemieckie to hitlerowskie to appease East Germany. So that's incorrect, just like using Nazi instead of Nazi Germany or Germany. So in this, I just want to share with you, this is an encyclopedic listing of all the places of persecution in occupied Poland. It includes all varieties of prisons, internment camps, transition camps, labor camps, interrogation camps, and prisons. And there are all these pages and 5,877 entries. So we go from A to Z. And this is compiled by a team headed by Professor Czesław, excuse me, is that on here? I'll find it in a second. But it's a team, and the bibliography is amazing. Each entry has a few centimeters, of bibliography of sources, of archives, and at the end of encyclopedic listing, there are several pages, a dozen pages with 2 columns. If anyone wants to study this, the resources are super rich and documented. So this is a listing of the types of camps and prisons, which is unbelievable. They range from court prisons to police prisons to labor camps run by the SS, labor camps run by the Gestapo, and POW camps. So hundreds of thousands of people went through these, and a lot of people died in them. So as one example, I looked closely at Łódź, which is an internationally known city, the Manchester of Poland, with a huge, very multi-ethnic population. So I looked closely at the listing for this one city, which is numbers from 2,577 in this listing of 5,877 entries. And among this listing, this is what we have. In the city of Łódź, which is not counted in that first category that I showed you of 535 systems of camps, this is in a city. Germans took over factories, schools, all the places, buildings, and turned them into prisons, into interrogation centers. And this is what was located in one city. One POW camp for, I think this should have said for Soviet prisoners, 2 POW camps for Poles, 6 transition camps for Poles, and they sorted, this is where they sorted people for the general government, for the Third Reich camps, resettlement camp, one ghetto, out of that, one entry is for the ghetto, police prison, you see the range. Someone will be speaking about reconsidering Jan Gross, and I just wanted to quote you something. In 1977, the infamous Jan Gross actually published a wonderful book, a very important book on the German Polish society and the German occupation, and it's been out of print. And I just learned in the last few days that it's republished. Princeton University. Go out and buy it because it's an incredibly well-documented history of the bestiality, as he put it, in German-occupied Poland. And in a preface, Gross stresses that he's not covering the inevitably visible takeover by communists, and that he also is not dealing with the Jewish Poles because that was a separate category, that was, I just showed you in the Łódź example, and that there's a lot of documentation on that, so he is not dealing with that. So this is Stuffhof camp, one of the examples, where I visited the camp. It was 1 kilometer from the shore, and I was told that prisoners never saw the Baltic coast. There are many sub-camps. One was as far as Toruń, a munitions factory. I can provide the information if anyone wants to see me afterwards in the sources, but I'm just going to sum it up. But in Stutthof, the camp was also a private source of slave labor. Outside of the perimeter of the gates, German corporations would come and rent slave laborers for very cheap. So, and many of them worked on private farms. So the whole economy of the German occupation was extensively supported by slave labor. I'll just show you what camp entry looks like. This is a fellow camp mate of my father's who perished in 4 months. That was the average. People were exterminated through forced labor. And this is the entry for my father, which I found when I visited the camp a few years ago. And a quick example of how war was very good for business. IG Farben industry, which still is doing well. Bayer is one of those firms. Look at the profits. It's not multiplied by percentages. These are humongous jumps. So I will end with a quote from, leave much of this for later, just show you example of the consequences of misinformation, of what happened to the narrative. After the Eichmann trial, as I said, there was a tremendous paradigm shift. The narrative changed, and it became a very strong American story. We say needs on us business, but that's exactly what happened. Our history is being told here. So this is, if you would read, look at the bold print. After the Eichmann trial revealed what was happening in the ghettos, the famous Elie Wiesel made a comment that is not only historically inaccurate, but it's defamatory, because he said at the end, no wonder that all the camps were built in Poland, as if Poles would collaborate in the genocide. The camps were built for Poles to extract the labor, to exterminate people through forced labor. And the way some of this, I'll just show one slide with what happens in the academic world, how this gets categorized, because knowledge is sorted, it's repeated, it's framed, and that's very important for the historical narrative. And what happens in libraries, for example, because many of the people who are working in libraries are educated on this warped, incomplete, false history. So you end up getting categories, keywords that have nothing to do with the reality. I think look at The Zookeeper's Wife, the famous book. I asked the author, after I was looking for it in a library, in a bookstore, I went to World War II, it wasn't there. So I went to biography, it wasn't there. So I went to the desk and I was told it's under the Holocaust section. But she deliberately said, The Zookeeper's Wife, a war story. It's about the war against Poland. Thank you.